Hi Alfred, how are you?
I'm very fine, Diana. How are you?
Good.
Ah,
Kindly introduce yourself before we jump into our very interesting topic today.
thank you so much for having me today. And today we'll be discussing about public-private partnerships, and specifically we'll be delving into the discussion of the actualizing investment dreams through public-private partnerships.
Thank you. So, maybe you can explain to us in detail what are public-private partnerships, especially for people who are hearing this terminology for the first time.
Thank you so much. And ideally, public-private partnerships are also referred to as PPPs, or sometimes people call it P3. And ideally, these are long-term contractual agreements between the government or a government institution and a private investor, which could either be an individual or a private institution, depending on the case.
Okay, I think that's quite interesting. I really like the acronyms there, P3 or PPP. What would you consider as essential elements of PPPs?
So just we've said like these are collaboration, ideally between the government and the private investor. And one key thing for people to note is that in as much as we are saying we have a private investor coming on board in this kind of PPP projects, the government still retains the ownership of this kind of project. And the key elements which present in this kind of arrangement is first, there will be a contractual agreement, and the contractual agreement will set out the terms in which the two parties, that is the government and the private investor, are coming on board to do. And there will be terms and condition. And secondly, there are two parties involved in this kind of transaction. There is the government entity which is coming on board with the project, and there's a private investor who is coming on board to perform that particular transaction, and which is a project. And thirdly, there's a timeline, because every transaction has a timeline. And specifically for this kind of projects in Kenya, they are governed by the Public Private Partnership Act of 2022, and the timeline set for this kind of transaction is usually 30 years, not more than 30 years. So it is assumed that within this timeline, the private investor will have recouped all their investments, and they would have gotten returns on these investments. Then lastly, there are risks which are involved. So the kind of risks involved is the investor is taking up a risk to perform this government project, and it's assumed that they are assuming this particular risk on carrying out this particular project.
Okay. Thank you, Alfred. I think that's very interesting. Would you have an example that would help us put into perspective what PPPs are and how they manifest in our days to day?
Thank you so much, Diana. That's a very interesting question. And I would particularly want to give this very, very common example of PPP, and is the Nairobi Expressway, in which is the current actually PPP we have in the country. And that's a type of PPP which is called a business concession. So ideally, is the government coming on board on onboarding a private investor perform a government project, which is usually like it's a more or less, like if we put it in quotes, it's a win-win situation. The government is getting a project and the investor is getting investments. So I would say a perfect example of a PPP we have in the country is Nairobi Expressway. Also, there have been other notable PPPs. For example, there are some developments which have been made to institutions like Kenyatta University. There are some hostels which have been developed by private investors. So ideally, these are just projects which are being undertaken by private investors for the benefit of the government. And also, I would say that they are for the benefit of the private investor, considering the fact that they are getting returns on their investments. Yeah.
Okay, that's quite interesting. I think something that I would also add there is they also serve the public, or they help to achieve a public good. Yeah, so that's quite interesting. I think that now brings me to, or it brings to mind another question that I have. In such kind of, with such kind of PPPs, what are key factors for consideration for the private investor, for the government, and all stakeholders concerned?
Thank you. So, particularly for every private investor who is pumping in money into a particular investment, there's some key factors they would want to take into consideration, because ideally nobody wants to pump in money into a project where there is very low rate of the project succeeding. So for the private investor out there looking out to engage in public-private partnership, there are several key factors. The first factor will be the how is the legal environment like? What's the regulatory landscape like in that particular country where the investor is seeking to invest? So the investor might be interested to look at what are the laws governing this kind of landscape, and how are these projects, the PPP projects, regulated? And the second aspect, which is actually tied to the first aspect of regulatory environment, would be like the risk factor. What are the risks which I'm assuming in this kind of project? I don't want to assume as a private investor, I don't want to assume into a risk where like my project, my investment is going to just go like that. The success rate is very minimal. Then the third consideration will be my protection as an investor. So this one is usually coined as a foreign investor protection. So an investor will be very particular in engaging in a transaction where they feel like their needs have been protected, and their investment, not particularly like their returns on investments, are also protected. Then lastly, the investor would also want to also take into consideration the time frame for this particular project. How many years, what's the duration this particular project is going to take, so that as the investor I can know that this is the time frame I'll be able to get returns on my investments, and these are the compensation or the returns I'll be able to make after the completion of that particular project. Yeah.
Okay, I think that's quite interesting. And a quick question that I have is, it seems like it's a bit of a complex transaction to undertake, and there's a lot of factors to consider. So there might be on the face advantages, but I think it's important to consider the advantages also together with the disadvantages. Top of your mind, what would you say are the advantages of PPPs, and maybe contrast them to the disadvantages of PPPs?
Thank you so much, Diana. That's a very actually that's one of the questions which every investor should have in their mind. What are the advantages? What are the shortcomings of this particular transaction I'm engaging in? So, particularly the first thing which, in terms of advantages, is the investor should note is that there are better returns on investments. These are kind of investment where if an investor pumps in money in this kind of transaction, the returns are immense. Like the investor is going to get very, very high returns. Then the second aspect in which is it's an advantage to the investor is in as much as we are saying there are returns, the investor also gets to collaborate with the government on projects, on diverse projects. And through this way, by engaging in this kind of project, the investor also is able to gain more expertise in this kind of transaction. Then the second aspect of advantage in terms of for the government is the government is able to get excellent, very good infrastructure, because it is assumed that these kind of projects are usually undertaken by experts in different fields. So they are better and excellent infrastructure solutions for the country. Then the other advantage is it reduces tax burdens on citizens. So, because ideally in a normal circumstance, citizens will be taxed so that the tax and the revenue collected by the government goes towards funding that particular project. But now here comes an investor who is coming on board to perform this particular project. So the tax burdens on citizens are reduced to a great extent. Then in terms of disadvantages, the first key disadvantage is always the risk, the kind of risk which this investor is assuming. So that's the first kind of disadvantage. But it's always important to mention that risk can be mitigated, and there are ways in which this shortcoming can be mitigated. Then the other shortcoming could be the duration in which the investor is going to recoup their compensation and their returns. So these are very key consideration in which investors should they think it's a disadvantage to them depending on the kind of project they are undertaking. But I would mention that in as much as a project might take time to complete, the returns are very immense. They are great returns on that investments in as much as it might take time to complete.
Mm. Okay, I think then you've highlighted the advantages. Then, what's the flip side of those advantages? What are the risks, or what would call disadvantages of PPPs?
I think I've mentioned some of the disadvantages or the shortcomings, but one of them is just the way I've stated is the risk involved in this transaction. Then the second one is the time frame. Like some projects, PPP projects take time to complete, so some investor might be worried on the duration in which this project will take. Then others is that there are some aspects of maybe low returns on their investment, and I would think that's a worry on some investors.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you. I'm just curious to find out, is there a way we classify the types of PPPs according to the purpose?
Thank you so much, Diana. That's a very, very interesting question because to our viewers out there, they might be asking like this PPP, this ideally a broad term. The public-private partnership is a really broad term, but inside there are different classification and different types of PPPs depending on the needs of the government and the needs of the private investor. So it's very important for the private investor and the government to be on the lookout in choosing the right and the correct PPP project. So there are diverse PPPs, and the first and the most common one is the business concessions. Just like the way we mentioned, the Nairobi Expressway is one of the business concessions where the government is collaborating with the private investor to perform this project. And other common PPP is known as build, operate, and transfer, abbreviated as BOT. And this one is the private investor comes on board, builds that particular project, operates, and ultimately transfers back that particular project to the government. Because as we've mentioned, these particular projects are usually owned by the government, and the private investor only comes on board to perform the project. And the other common PPP is known as operation and maintenance. And I would give this example to our viewers out there. The example is the Thika Superhighway. Most of the time, there are people who are maintaining the highway. And that's a good example of operation and maintenance because the private investor is coming on board to operate and sometimes maintain maybe the road to ensure that the road is in good condition. Then the other type of PPP is build, lease, and transfer. Sometimes the private investor can come on board, build that particular project, lease it, and ultimately they are supposed to transfer it back to the government. Then other common types of PPPs, but not most common in our country. Maybe the investor is operating and also financing. So this one is the private investor comes on board, operates it, and also finances that particular project, which the financing aspect it cuts across every project, but this one is operating and financing at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alfred. I think this has been quite an insightful conversation to have. As we close, what would you say are your key takeaways when it comes to public-private partnerships?
Thank you so much, Diana. So I would say that these are very evolving space in terms of investments, because I believe that we've been socialized to the traditional forms of investments. So these might not be and well-known type of investments, but it's a very evolving and dynamic space in terms of investments. So the future in terms of PPPs is very bright in terms of investors taking up this type of projects for as a form of securing their investment dreams, because as we've mentioned, the returns on this kind of government projects are very immense. So mine is just to call on private institution, private investors to consider this form of investments as a way of maybe achieving their investment dreams.